Hello everyone, and welcome to Trail Shreds, and today I'm going to be doing a review of my bike, which is the Zerode Taniwha. Now this bike is definitely a bit different from most other enduro bikes because it has a gearbox drivetrain, so all of the shifting happens internally unlike a conventional drivetrain, and it's likely because of this that this bike is a real head turner. This video is basically going to be a long-term review of this bike. I'm not sponsored by Zerode if it wasn't obvious enough, so I'm going to mention every problem I've had with this bike and obviously every upside as well that I've found in the year that I've owned this bike. So yeah, let's get into it. So out of the box, the Taniwha Mullet Voyager build costs about 9,460 New Zealand dollars and comes with a mullet setup, hence the name, with a 29 wheel in the front and a 27.5 in the rear. The frame is carbon with 160 millimeters of travel and is painted with a beautiful shade of blue, but the paint itself is actually quite fragile. I found this out the hard way when I was tying it to my rack. I had the type of rack where you just bungee cord the bike onto it, and the bungee just went right straight through the first layer of paint, which was quite frustrating, so I'd probably put some frame protection on it if I were to buy this bike again. Anyway, so the stock rims were Stan's EX3 aluminum rims. I have swapped them out for carbon ones for better strength, although the stock rims were pretty decent. I did manage to bend the rear one. Now, the stock tires are Vittoria Maz's, both being 2.4 inches wide. I've had no issues with these in terms of grips, so they've been performing quite well. I did actually get a flat on the rear, but that's probably because I was running way too low of tire pressures for what I was doing, so yeah, just kind of got a pinch flat, and yeah, so I have a Maxxis one on the back now. In terms of suspension, this bike comes with Fox 36 factory with 160 millimeters of travel in the front. Now, I'm actually not sure whether this bike is meant to have a Fox 36 factory as stock, because on the website it just says Fox 36, but this is what mine came with, so yeah. Anyway, in the back there's a factory float X2, also with 160 millimeters of travel. Both the fork and shock have been performing flawlessly, although the shock could probably use a service as it's been making some interesting noises recently. Moving on to the seat post, this bike comes with a Bike Yoke Revive dropper post. On the size medium, they usually come with a 150mm, but I actually got upgraded to a 180mm, so that was nice of them. This is actually a pretty nice dropper post. I think that the lever feels really good, but it has gotten a bit slow over time, but that's nothing that can't be repaired, just pump it up. This bike also comes with Magura MT5 brakes. I found that these are plenty strong for me. The rear brake did need a bleed pretty badly quite recently as it was pulling straight up to the bar, but other than that they've been performing pretty good. The drivetrain is of course a Gearbox, which is the Pinion C-Line 9-speed gearbox, which I'll get into shortly. Now, I'd also like to mention a bit about geometry. This size medium has a 445mm reach, which is probably a bit small for me as I'm basically right on the limit of the size at 176 centimeters. According to the website, this bike has a 63.5 degree head angle, which is pretty much in line with modern enduro bikes. However, when I purchased the bike, it said that the head angle was actually 65 degrees, so in the end I'm not 100% sure whether it's 63.5 or 65 degrees. Either way, the bike feels good on the trail. It does feel quite comfortable, even though it's probably a bit small for me. Alright, so now it's time to talk about the main reason most of you probably clicked on this video, which is the gearbox. So this gearbox is a 9-speed Pinion gearbox. There is also a 12-speed version, but I'm pretty sure that's only available on the deluxe build. This gearbox has a 568% gear range, which is quite a bit more than you'll find on any derailleur drivetrain today. Now, a 568% gear range may sound appealing, but in my opinion, the highest gear on this bike is a bit too high. I'd much rather have them make the lowest gear even lower to be able to climb hills easier, as the highest gear is almost too high to be usable, and I feel like I could use an easier gear on this bike. Now let's get into how this thing shifts, as it is a bit different to a normal drivetrain. The way you shift on this gearbox is you basically have to stop pedaling to actually shift, and then you can shift as many gears as you want as long as you're not pedaling. Now that may sound like a downside, but because it shifts instantly, you only have to stop pedaling for a very small fraction of a second, shift however many gears you need, and continue pedaling, which in my opinion is better than having to wait for your gears to shift on a conventional drivetrain. Plus, that means that you can shift while you're stationary, which I find very useful. It's worth mentioning that in some of the easier gears, shifting doesn't really require you to fully stop pedaling, as you can just ease off the power slightly, and then it'll let you shift. Unfortunately, this doesn't work for the higher gears though. Now, the shifter on this bike is actually a grip shifter, and most people might be turned off by that, but hear me out. I think it's actually better than a regular shifter for this bike. This is because the grip shifter allows me to shift as many gears as I want in one singular motion, and because the shifts are instant, you can go from the easiest gear to the hardest gear on this bike in one shift, and you'll actually be in that gear when you put down the power. Now, it probably sounds like I really like this drivetrain, but that doesn't mean that there aren't any downsides. The main downside that I found is the resistance when pedaling. To be honest, when I first got this bike, I didn't really notice it, but in the past few months I've really started to feel it when climbing. It almost feels like I'm riding with a flat tire. Now, if you're wondering why the resistance is there, it's because of all the gears inside the gearbox which your input has to pass through to get output into turning the rear wheel, and all those gears create friction, which is why the resistance is there. Now, I'm not really sure why I've started to feel the resistance more recently. I did change the oil in the gearbox the other day, but that did nothing to affect the resistance. Changing the oil is really the only maintenance you need to do to this drivetrain. You just change the oil once a year, which is quite an easy procedure. You do need to change the belt, but it is supposed to last like 3 times longer than a chain, which is good because it is quite pricey. Now, the belt is another component of this drivetrain which is a bit out of the ordinary. To me, it feels just like a chain when pedaling, and it should last a lot longer and be stronger as well, so for this bike it's probably better than a chain. It doesn't slip even in the wet, which is good, but that's likely due to the tension and being extremely tight. Like, I can barely even bend this thing back, it's like really tight. Actually, speaking of the tensioner, there's one thing I'd want to say about it, which is that after a little while it tends to develop a bit of a creak. When this first happened to me, I actually thought it was my shock that was creaking, but it turned out that it was the belt tensioner. On the bright side, it is quite an easy fix. You just gotta spray some silicone on the spring, or some tire shine works fine in my experience. Now, back to the belt, which I have actually found has one major flaw, which is that it creaks as well. Out of the box it doesn't creak, but after riding it for a bit, when pedaling it does develop a bit of a creaking sound, which can get quite annoying. Now, I've found that if you just spray it with some water, the creak actually goes away. However, this is only a temporary solution, as it usually comes back after some riding. Now, another thing that's worth mentioning about this drivetrain is the engagement. The rear hub has a pretty good hub in it, so the engagement's pretty good in that. But it actually doesn't matter because the gearbox itself has a hub inside of it, which has very sloppy engagement. To some people that can be a major downside, but to me, honestly, I don't find it too annoying, but it's still worth noting. Anyway, that's pretty much all I have to say about this drivetrain, so do I think that it's worth it? Well, actually, yes. In my opinion, I prefer this drivetrain to a conventional one, as to me the upsides outweigh the downsides. Just the shifting performance of this drivetrain is unmatched in my opinion, but it's definitely not for everyone. This drivetrain, actually just this bike in general, by far struggles the most on climbing, which I'll get into now. Now, I've found that climbing is the discipline where this bike struggles the most, and there are various reasons to why this is. One of the main reasons is actually the geometry. The seat tube angle is fairly slack in comparison to most modern enduro bikes at 74.5 degrees, which makes your position when pedaling feel quite inefficient. Like I mentioned earlier, the resistance from the gearbox also weakens this bike's performance on the climbs. In my opinion, the long climbs are really where you notice the inefficiency of this bike, to the point where it's almost frustrating how sluggish this bike feels when climbing. One more thing that's worth mentioning is that this bike isn't exactly the quietest, but only when climbing. On the descents it's actually really quite quiet, but on the uphills it tends to develop some random noises in various places, which is a bit odd. I'm not sure if that has something to do with dirt ingress or maybe a lack of lubrication somewhere, but at least it's quiet on the downs. Now, descending is by far where this bike shines the most. The downhill performance of this bike is very good in comparison to all other disciplines in my opinion. You could really almost throw anything at this bike and I'm sure it'd be able to handle it. Everything I've thrown at this bike so far it's been able to handle with ease. It's handled the gnarliest tech I've ridden pretty well, although I haven't ridden anything too gnarly as tech scares me quite a bit, but I'm sure this bike would do well on even gnarlier stuff. In terms of jumps, this bike also does really well. It jumps better than any other bike that I've ridden. In fact, I managed to hit my biggest gap jump ever, which is over 40 feet, and it handled that with no issues. Also, in my experience, it's easy to whip and throw around this bike in the air, at least in contrast to my old bike, despite it weighing over 16 kilograms. So yeah, this bike does extremely well when descending, and you'd expect nothing less. I assume that the reason this bike is so good at going downhill is the unsprung weight being kept to a minimum. With this bike not having a cassette and derailleur on the back, I found that this lets the rear suspension work really well and soak up a lot of the bumps, which is quite nice. Now there is actually one thing this bike struggles with downhill, which is basically just big hucks. Now, I've only had this be a problem on one trail, and if you're wondering what this trail is, it's Shred the Needle in the Woodhill Bike Park, which has this one big drop on it, and you can just huck it as far as you want, and I've seen some people send this thing really far. Now, every time I send it far enough off this drop, it does feel quite harsh. I never expect it to feel harsh, but almost every time it does, and I think this is due to the bike only having 160mm of travel front and rear. I think you could use a bit more travel than that, but unless you're doing massive hucks, I found that it's not really necessary for this bike. So in conclusion, is this a good bike? Well, I think it's entirely dependent on what you're looking for in a bike. Now, I think that if you're looking for a bike with a very reliable drivetrain and that's capable on the downs and don't really care about how well it climbs, then this will be the bike for you. If you care about climbing performance, I'd look into getting another bike, as you might not have the best time on this one. For me personally, I think it's a pretty good match. Downhill capability is quite important to me, so this bike certainly does me well on that. Now, I'd of course want a bike that climbs better, but to me, the drivetrain outweighs most of the downsides. To me, it's much nicer to use than a conventional drivetrain, as the shifting performance is just astonishing, even if the shifting is a bit different. Now, would I buy this bike again? Well, that is a tough question, but I'm not sure that I'm willing to give up this drivetrain for a normal one again. I really like this thing, but normal drivetrains still have a leg up on gearboxes on some things, so I'm still undecided on whether my next bike will be a Zerode or not. Anyway, I hope you guys found this video helpful. If you're looking into getting a Zerode and have any more questions, just drop a comment. I know that I probably left some details out on this video, so yeah. Anyway, that'll pretty much do it for the video. Showed you guys what I like and what I don't like about my Zerode Taniwha. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video guys, like, subscribe, and thanks for watching. Oh god. Ah, my freaking thumb. Oh crap, I sliced my thumb up. Oh, that's not good.